Hello. Welcome back to the David Watson podcast. This morning, or at least this morning for me, I spoke with Sylvia and we talked about her book, Grasp the Nettle, based in 1920s Australia. And I loved it. It is that, talking about that time in history that is so separated from now. And I love those conversations and I always feel really lucky when I get to have them. And I hope you enjoy the episode. Good morning. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, David. And you?
I'm very well. And it's nice to meet you. And hello to your assistant, Jenny, who's helping you with the tech side of life.
Thank you.
And
thank you. Yes, I can find the mute button on the remote control for the TV, and that's about the extent of my tech savviness.
I actually, people would be amazed at how much I understand that, because I do this podcast and people assume that I know what I'm doing. All I know what to do is I like the sound of my own voice, so I'm pretty good at talking. That's the extent of my knowledge. And it looks kind of, like I said, it'll go out, it'll be edited, but no, I just, as long as everything, when you were saying about the TV, is when you go to switch the TV on, if it doesn't work, you're like, well, I know how to replace the batteries in the remote. If it's not that, I need help.
Yes.
That's my level.
That's a very honest response here.
It is what it is. So whereabouts are you in Australia?
As far west as you can go on this island. And in Western Australia, from Perth, we are 1,500 kilometres north. And if you go another 1,500 kilometres north, you get to Broome, which is a well-known town. And then you've got another 1,000 to reach Darwin. So it's big open country. The nearest town south from here is 300 kilometres and the nearest north 600 kilometres. The distances are mind-numbing.
They are. In 2016, I went to Melbourne. And it was my first time in Australia, and I had friends. I really, so lucky. I had two friends that, a couple that lived in Geelong, which is just outside Melbourne, and I had a school friend that lived in Melbourne. So I did a week with one, just outside, Melbourne in Geelong, right by the coast, enjoying the beach, and my other friend who lived just sort of in the Melbourne suburbs, about a 10-minute walk from the beach. And people are like, did you go sightseeing? No. I drank beer and sat on the beach. That's pretty much but it was just amazing because the first week I was there, my friend lent me his car, and there was a few of us that had all flown over, and you drive for like an hour. And then I can't remember what the name of the town was called. I think it was Lawn or something. I don't remember. But it had this lovely beach, and we would hang out there. And I got to feed like cockatoos that just come down like they were pigeons with grapes and stuff. And it was amazing, because obviously we don't get that in the UK. But when you look at a map, it didn't even register that we'd moved.
Yes. A lot of people coming from Europe make this exactly the same mistake. They don't recognise the distances.
No.
I think if you have a map of Australia and superimpose over the top of it at the same scale and tracing paper or something, a map of Europe, I think they just fit one over the top of the other exactly.
I didn't know that. People are surprised that, because if you look at the size of the UK, it's tiny. Absolutely tiny, and you can fit it into like entire states. It's just like our whole country would just fit there, and you're just like, wow, I've got room for an extension and everything. There's acres of land left over. So what town are you in then?
What time?
No,
Western
what town?
Standard.
Yeah, what town?
Oh, town. Exmouth. Exmouth, a tiny little town right on the coast.
Nice.
Right on the Northwest Cape Peninsula. It's very much an outdoors activities area. There's wonderful wildlife everywhere, especially in the water, and it's a famous place for tourists being able to swim with whale sharks and whales.
Okay.
And this coral reef here, which is just superb, better quality really than the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland, but on a much smaller scale. And there's every sea creature you can imagine: dugong and manta rays and anything. They're all here.
I did not know that at all. This is every day is a school day. So, is that your book? Is that what your book is based on then? Like that area?
Very close to here. It's historical information relating to the next town south of here. The historical information is correct. The story is about the impact of gender diversity really on everyday life in that era, which was the 1920s, when there were enormous social constraints on people and social expectations. And it's a story about two people trying to make the best of their opportunities. That Tom and Elsie, they get married, and Tom is trying to do what his father wants. His father wants him to get married and produce a son and heir for the family, because Tom's brother enlisted and went away to the war, as so many Australian men did. This is the First World War,
Yeah.
and he never came home from France. And so it becomes the duty of the next son to provide an heir for the family. And he marries Elsie. Elsie is a vivacious young woman, full of energy and enthusiasm, but she's constrained too by social expectations and whatnot. And the only place they can live is a tiny hut well out of town. Of course, it's got no amenities, and it's too far from town for her to get into town very often, because she has no horse and there's no public transport. It's too far to walk. And she's full of vim and vigour, and the only book she has to read is the King James version of the Bible. So she starts reading it from cover to cover. And of course, she makes very individual interpretations of some of the text. And she records all this in a diary. And Tom also keeps a diary, a journal. He has a job of distributing the Royal Mail to country districts, because there was no internet, there was no smartphones, no emails. So much of what we take for granted today had not yet been invented. And Tom is doing this job with newest gadget imaginable, a truck, instead of a horse and cart or camels. And so he has lots to learn about how to look after a truck, an engine and so forth. There was no information. And so his journal records all sorts of statistics too about what yield you get from a wool clip, and how many sheep you can have per acre, which is the reverse here. It's how many acres per sheep, and so forth. And Elsie, she's trying her best, of course, and she shows great empathy to this man she's married in an arranged marriage. For instance, when he is chopping firewood for their open fire, which is her only means of cooking, she recognises that he seems to be letting off steam and worked up about something, but she doesn't question him. She simply makes the extra effort to cook him something she knows he really enjoys, such as an apple pie, which she's able to do on an open fire because she's savvy enough to know how to rig up a Dutch oven.
Yeah.
And cook it that way. So
there's people listening like, what's a Dutch oven?
Well, a Dutch oven is where you have a cast iron, for instance.
Yeah.
Casserole dish, if you like. So you put the casserole dish in the coals of your fire, but to stop the apple pie burning, you keep the pie dish off the bottom of that casserole dish, by putting in 3 or 4 pebbles for it to sit on, so it's not coming in contact directly with the hot base of the casserole dish.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but there's something you mentioned that that people today just will not understand, that the arranged marriage was not unusual.
That's right.
And there were several reasons it may have been done, but more often than not, it was because you were of an age and your parents, we can't keep paying for you. You have to become independent.
And there was another angle. We can't keep paying for you, but we are going to need you to look after us when we become old and infirm. There was no social security as we know it today, and no dole as we know it today. Work was the order of the day, and family was extremely important, much more so, I think, than today. And
because without that kind of that family tie, you wouldn't survive. People take it, like, really do take it for granted, but you could do something simple if you were like living as remote as those people would have lived. You could do something as simple as sprain your ankle. Well, if nobody knows you sprained your ankle, nobody's coming to help you. And if you can't walk home, and even you managed to get home, but if you're laid up for 2 or 3 days, you might lose your livestock. You won't have any food. You're going to die because you sprained your ankle. Whereas today, if I sprain my ankle and I can't walk to my car, I can phone somebody and get them to pick me up, and then they'll go pick up my car. Yes,
and that kind of thing is reflected in the story of the book. Tom recognises that Elsie is heavily pregnant and so forth, and life is difficult for her, but he says, I can't stop working. There would be nobody to replace me in this job. People know how to shoe a horse, tend camels and so forth, but nobody knows how to keep a truck going. I've just got to keep going. And if I found someone else to do my job, what income would I have?
Yeah.
You see? Yeah.
Because it's interesting as well, because it's when I've talked about this on the podcast before. I'm half Irish. My mum was born in Southern Ireland, and my nan is obviously Irish from deep South Ireland, and she emigrated over to the UK with my granddad, my mum, her brother and sister in the 60s, I think it was. But my nan used to tell me, when we used to go back home to Ireland, my nan would talk to me about on the podcast. There's this story that I'm always telling about. We used to stay in the family farmhouse, and which is just a small homestead type thing. And my nan was one of 13 children that grew to become adults, because there was obviously a bit of child mortality back in those days. And I think it was 18 children, but only 13 become adults or something. I might have those numbers slightly wrong. But we used to have to walk from the house, the family home, to her sister's, Aunt Betty's, who's sadly no longer here either. And I would be about 8 or 9 years old. So the walk is probably nowhere near as long and dramatic as I remember it. Right? Yes. But there's this crossroads, and at this crossroads is a water pump. And no matter how many times we walked past that water pump, my nan would tell me the story about how when they were children, before they went to school, they used to have to walk up to the water pump with their buckets, fill up the buckets with water, because there was no running water at home. And you wouldn't dare spill the water, because you'd have to walk back and you'd be late for school. So you'd be getting a hiding. But she'd also tell me, because they were so poor, they never had shoes, so they used to have to walk barefoot. So there's this little boy who's complaining, and it just does not wash with my nan at all, because when she was my age, she was carrying buckets her size, twice the weight, in barefoot.
Yes, and that wasn't unusual. That was ordinary life.
Yeah. I mean, the water pump effectively is on a crossroads for a reason, because it's a joining point where anybody can reach it. And you would probably, I would imagine that back in the day, you would queue sometimes to use the water pump, because nobody had running water. There was just fields everywhere. There was no
exactly.
infrastructure.
Yes.
And it's such a different time.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, where did the name Grasp the Nettle come from?
I probably should have called it "Take the Bull by the Horns." People would probably understand it better. But it is an old saying. Nettle plants grow wild, or they especially like to grow near hen houses, domestic gardens. And if you brush against it lightly, it really, really stings. But if you grab hold of it, if you have the courage to really grab hold of it, it doesn't sting you at all. And it was an old saying when I was a child, oh, go on, just find the courage to get something done, grasp the nettle.
Yeah, because that's how I remember. Because I know the saying, and I was just wondering if it, if it was actually something kind of like connected to some. But it is. It's just that attitude, isn't it? It's just like, yeah, life is uncomfortable, so just get on with it.
Yes, and it's a saying from that era, the 1920s. Yes, lots of sayings are falling out of fashion, like being taken aback. That's from the sailing days, and the bitter end. That's another sailing one.
I didn't. I know that. I know to be taken aback, and I know the bitter end, but I don't know the meanings behind or the origins behind them.
Well, if your sails are full of wind,
Yeah,
they're billowing, and you're going in the direction presumably you want to go. But if you maneuver the boat incorrectly or the wind changes, the wind can get on the wrong side of the sails and take them aback.
yeah,
And
okay.
you're out of control, and you're not in control of where your ship is going. That's that one. And the bitter end, the anchor line is tied to the bitts on the deck.
Yeah.
The rope must be fastened to the ship. Otherwise, you throw your anchor overboard and wave goodbye to it because you haven't tied the end of the line onto your ship. So you tie it to the bitts.
Okay.
And things are getting really grim. You're coming to the bitter end. This is the end nearest the bitts kind of thing.
But I often talk about that. People misunderstand that these kind of sayings and cliches had deep meaning. They would really either like it was incredibly so like grasp the nettle.
Yes.
It's practical advice, but it has a deep philosophical underline to it. It's just like no, life is uncomfortable. And you're going to get stung sometimes, but you have to just, like you say, you have to just grab it because that there's no other way because life is going to happen anyway, and you're going to get stung. But if you grab hold of it, it's less uncomfortable.
Yes, absolutely. And everybody understood those old sayings, and it's a pity they're falling out of use.
It is because there's a terrible thing about humans just generally. We're so. We're not inherently lazy. We're inherently efficient, and we take the path of least resistance. And because we become so efficient at doing that, we don't understand what hardship is.
Yes, you're probably right there.
And I always remember I used to sorry, excuse me. I used to work when I was like 18. I used to work in the local civil service, and you can imagine there's a real array of ages. So I'd be working alongside men that are due to retire in 6 months' time, and I'm literally just starting my working life, and they would tell me stories about the first jobs that they ever got when they were my age, and they lived in the middle of nowhere. There was no public transport, and they used to have to walk. There was this one guy, he used to have to walk, I think it was 5 miles to a spot on the road where he could get a lift, and then it was like a 30-minute drive to work. So there was like 2 hours either side of his working day, and then he was expected to go and do a proper day's work, as a labourer. And he said that he said everybody was doing that. That wasn't, and his lift was just getting in the back of a truck. No covers. Yes. If it was raining, you got wet. If it was sunny, you got sunburn.
Yes, well, people were far more used to being out in the weather. I remember taking my mother to an antique car rally once, not, what do they call a vintage car rally. You see, my mother's father, that's my grandfather, bought the second motor car ever sold in Tasmania.
Wow.
And drove it home to the sheep station. But again, that would have been 1920. So a lot of the information in Grasp the Nettle is first-hand information from my mother. And they had this car and it had a canvas roof on it. And I took my mother to this vintage car rally, and the first car to come along, it was a glorious sunny day, and we were standing right on the edge of the pavement where these cars were going to come parading past. And the first car appeared, and it was very similar to the one her father had bought, with spoked wheels and a canvas roof. And the people sitting in the car had scarves tied around their heads to stop their hair blowing everywhere because there were no windows. And my mother took one look at this and she said, "Oh, how silly."
Yeah.
And I said, "What on earth's the matter?" And she explained. They had a car with a canvas roof, and she said, "We never put the roof up unless it was actually raining," because they were used to walking everywhere in the weather or climbing onto a saddle out in the rain or riding in the back of a trap or something out in the weather. And she couldn't believe that these people were so silly on a sunny day. They had the canvas roof up. Yes,
there's a mentality from hardship that you cannot train. You can't hand it on. You can't, there's, when I think of the stories my nan used to talk to me about, and the life that my granddad would have had, you can't gift children experience.
No, you can't put an old head on young shoulders.
No, exactly that, 100%. It can't be done. But we can be guilty of looking at it through nostalgia, and nostalgia can be quite blinkered. But those people also had a resolve that my generation and the people below me don't have. We get upset because somebody doesn't agree with our opinions. If you lived on a farmstead in Northern Australia, Southern Australia, Western, or wherever you were, you didn't know what anybody's opinion was because you hadn't seen anyone for 6 months.
Yes. You certainly didn't hear any world news very quickly. It was 6 months for a letter to travel from Australia back to England, where a lot of people had come from. It was the gold rush era that changed the population here. People from every nationality came here then, and it became a real melting pot of cultures and races and people. But both my great-great-grandfathers came from England, from the UK, and there's lots of family information about the history of the family. My mother's great-grandfather left Scotland to sail to Cape Town, and no, I'm sorry, that's my father's great-grandfather left Scotland to sail to Cape Town, but when the ship got there, no one was allowed to disembark because there'd been measles on board.
Oh, wow.
And so he had to stay aboard for the next port of call, which was Hobart. And he got to Hobart in 1820. It was a very young colony. And, of course, he went to the governor's tent. There was no governor's residence, and he clapped his hands. You couldn't knock on the door. There wasn't a door. And you couldn't shout out. That was uncouth and uncivilized. So you clapped your hands, and out came the governor, and he said, I'd like some work, please. I've come here without intending to get here. And the governor said, well, the convicts do the work and the soldiers look after the convicts, and you're not a soldier. What can you do? And Tom Scott said, oh, well, I used to take the midday sight for the captain on the ship every day. I can use a sextant. And, you're a surveyor, said the governor. Well, go further up the river, the Derwent River. We want to know what's upstream. And Tom did this work for him, and it's all recorded in his journal, which is now in the Mitchell Library in Sydney.
Wow.
And he came back and said, again, I'd really like to be paid for the work I've done. And the governor said, well, yes, you've certainly done some work, but there's no money in the colony, for heaven's sake. The convicts don't get paid, and the soldiers just get credit at the government store. If you want payment for what you've done, just select some land. There's plenty of it. And come and tell me what you've selected, and I'll make an official record of it. So Tom's got selected land where the town of Scottsdale now stands.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, and that's all very well documented. And
that's fascinating, isn't it? Because, you know, look, I like to think I'm a man of the world and that I can hold my own most places. But I panic if I'm running late for a plane. And, you know, Scott gets on a boat to South Africa, gets to South Africa, it's like, you're not getting off because we've got measles. And then you end up in Australia, a place you never even intended to go, with no money, probably got some friends on the boat, but everyone, no pun intended, but is in the same boat. So, well, we've all got to sort of like go and eke out a living and eat. And he gets off the boat and literally is like, any chance anyone's got a job?
Yeah, there was nothing. No one expected free settlers in those days.
No.
It must have been extremely hard. And, of course, my other great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, my mother's great-grandfather, he was a convict. Family tradition says he was wrongfully convicted, and that's another very long story. And documentation about that is in the library in Coventry that keeps newspaper articles and information. I can't remember the name of it. But he was a convict. He was very quickly called a trustee, as they called the reliable convicts in those days. He was made a constable. People laugh because he was still a convict, but he was made a constable for the district in Tassie. And eventually he was pardoned because he used to break in horses. He was what we would now call a vet. He would break in horses for some extra money. And his letter home to Coventry says, with a good horse under me and 2 pistols, I was able to bring in 4 runaway convicts who had been bothering the district, stealing sheep and robbing huts and things. And he brought 4 of them in single-handed. And his wife, Mary, would have been opening gates and things for him, I'm sure, but women were not mentioned in those days.
No.
And so he did receive a pardon for that, which meant he was allowed to go back to the UK. But he never went. He loved it out here. And her letters home say it's just such a wonderful climate. Here it is, the middle of winter, and there's no snow on the ground anywhere. And parrots fly around our hut as thick as sparrows with you.
That's wise.
Yes.
Because it's hard, isn't it? There's a couple of things that people don't understand about the colony and stuff. Is lots of people who were sent to Australia were innocent.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's a famous site not too far from me. It's about an hour's drive away, which isn't, it's nothing to you guys, but I'd have to plan that journey. And it's the Toll Puddle 7. And they were 7. It was Toll Puddle 5 or Toll Puddle 7. I can't remember the story now. They were 5 or 7. They were farmhands who basically tied themselves to a tree out of protest because they weren't being paid enough. So the owner of the land, the landlord, I think he was a member of parliament or something like that. So he had them convicted under some form of maritime law and had them sent to Australia.
Yeah.
and they were innocent. But they are the reason today that we have unions. They were the first recognised union, a group of men who went on strike. But they were all eventually pardoned because people got involved. Like you had convicted them under maritime laws, naval laws, and they were nothing to do with maritime. They were farmers, and you weren't paying them. And so they all got reprieved, and I think some of them stayed and some of them come back. And it's so long since I heard the story, but there's lots of stories where people just fell out with a very wealthy, influential landowner or wealthy, influential person, and the next thing they know, they're on a boat to Australia as a convict. So you can imagine by the time they get to Australia, and it happens enough time, even people in the colony realise some of these guys haven't done anything wrong. They've just crossed the wrong person.
Yes, I think the policy, the government policy, was to populate this empty country. It wasn't that they suddenly thought we've got all these crims running around. They wanted to transport the culture of the UK out here to this country and settle it.
And you can imagine as well, you're the governor, and like you're the governor. You're in a tent. You're hardly back in London on Harley Street or something, and somebody turns up and it's like, well, what skills are you set? Oh, right, okay, you can be a surveyor then, because I haven't got anyone that can do that. And I don't care why you're here. You can't go home because there's no boat.
I don't care if you get speared to death trying to do it too.
Yeah, that's it. Nobody even knows you're here.
No. Yeah. Yes, he was a younger son too. He knew he would never inherit anything from his father, so he just had to make the best of the circumstances.
I really do. I try to understand what it must have felt like for them, because in many ways it's a one-way trip, and that. You're never seeing mum and dad again. You're not going to see brothers and sisters again, because even if you do decide to come back, it's going to be years before you get the money for the ticket to come back again. And there's lots of stories. One of my favourites is about a convict with the name Swallow, and he was sent out here, but he was so determined to get home to England, he escaped and stole a ship and had a handful of people with him, all wanting to do the same thing, and they actually sailed back to England. And it's a very heroic story. It's crazy.
But yes. There must have been great resilience among the people who survived. They'd all done 6 months quarantine on the way out here, for instance. Anybody who was sick or infirm would have not survived the journey. So they must have been tough people in the first place. And I think they were people trying to make the best of their circumstances, like my little protagonists in my little book, just trying to have the common sense, if you like, to not contest the system, but to try and fit in to the best of their ability and make the best of it. The book needs a reader with imagination. It doesn't go into very elaborate descriptions of things. There are things there that are revealed at the end, which only an imaginative reader can work out beforehand. And there's one thing at the very beginning that I have yet to find a reader who has identified. It's something missing from the very beginning. But again, you've got to be an imaginative reader. But I'm told it's a great success among book club.
That's good.
Yeah, because it's short and intense and unconventional, and yes, got lots of curiosities in it.
What inspired you to write a book?
Oh, I love writing, absolutely love writing. And my parents gave me a very good education. at a school that had no competition in it. So nobody knew who came top of the class or bottom of the class. We were all expected to just achieve our individual best. That was Merton Hall in Melbourne. And I think that increases your, again, the word empathy to other people. You're not competing, so you've got a better chance to really understand other people better, get on better with them. English literature was my favourite subject at school, and writing is just wonderful, and the English language is so wonderful. And I don't know if you have ever read The Last Will and Testament of William Shakespeare.
No, I haven't. I'm not an avid reader. I'm not somebody. I'm the sort of person that if I pick up a book, if I'm about 20 pages in and it becomes hard work, I'm not going to read the book. But if I'm sort of 10 pages in and I'm just captured, I'll have problems putting the book down. And I can sort of read a book in a day. But if it doesn't catch my attention, you can give me a month. I won't be able to get through it because I'd rather scratch my eyeballs out for pain relief.
Gotcha. Well, my book's very short, and I recommend that you read it.
I will. I'll try and read it. But I'm not an. Like it's funny because I talk to a lot of authors, and I have written my own book, but I'm not actually an avid reader. But I love talking to people who've written books and why they wrote them, and I love listening to the history and the stories. It fascinates me.
Uh-huh. Well, to get back to Shakespeare's Last Will and Testament, everybody knows that he became a very successful businessman and so forth. But in his early life, he was married to a woman who must have been a very unsuitable match, and the marriage was not a success. And he wrote this will knowing that he was sick and not going to recover from the illness. And he gives various things to various companies and so forth, theatre companies and whatnot, and kind of almost as a last aside, he says, "And to my wife I leave my second best bed," which is such economy of wording.
It is.
And yet it says so much, yes. It just tells us all that the marriage was not a success.
That's the genius, isn't it? Is that one line, "my second best bed," tells you everything you need to know about the marriage.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
and his unhappiness about it.
Yes, so he doesn't have to go into lengthy descriptions of how bad it was or anything else like that. Just a few words says so much, and he's so clever at that. He is, of course, the master of the English language.
It is. Wonderful. It's the one of the most. It's a strange one because people acknowledge it as just the genius of being able to say so much with so little words, but we're not very good at actually training people how to write like that.
I think he was an entrepreneur too, because before Shakespeare's dramas, writing was kind of constrained by what was considered to be classical. But Shakespeare seems to have picked up and used the vernacular, which the people loved. They understood exactly what he's talking about, and they could relate to what was being said. But it must have been very unconventional among the scholars.
Well, I think that's one of the problems at the time, and it's a problem that still exists today, that when something becomes, like reading back then, just reading, writing, and the printed word, there's a snobbery involved because you had to have some form of
Oh,
wealth to be educated, and some form of wealth
yes,
to have something in print. So it was very easy for you to look down at other people. Whereas that entrepreneur side of Shakespeare that you're talking about, he recognised there was an untapped audience, and that
yes,
almost, if I make this accessible for you, I don't need the wealthy influencers. And
exactly.
as always, when you make something popular, the wealthy influencers then want a part of it.
Well, it was a privilege to be able to read and write in the 1920s, and
Yeah,
most people did keep journals, but keeping a journal was also a way of identifying yourself as a high quality person. I've learnt to read and write, and yes, I keep a journal, and
yeah, I never thought about that.
Grasp the Nettle is extracts from the two diaries. So there's a page from hers and a page from his, and a page from hers and extract from his, and so forth. And because the writing is in different fonts, you can instantly tell, oh, she's written that.
Yeah.
Oh, that must be out of his. Oh, that's hers. This must be him talking. So you don't have to laboriously read on the page, this extract comes from Tom's journal. You just recognise that it must be
What gave you
his
the
journal.
idea to do it?
Partly because of when my father's great-grandfather came out from Scotland, he kept a journal all the way. And my father inherited that when I was 14. And this tiny little book and this scratchy little writing, and it was so interesting to read. And I just thought, that's really important stuff. It's really interesting. It had been prepared for publication by somebody, and a lot of things had been crossed out. And my mother worked out what had been crossed out because the ink used to cross phrases out had faded. It was a poorer quality than the original. So a couple of 100 years later, you could read what had been crossed out, you see.
Oh, wow.
And my mother worked out that everything that was crossed out referred to the fact that he travelled out steerage, second class. And somebody didn't want other people to know that. And I worked out that the one page that is torn with half a page missing is the page that would have recorded what happened when other steerage passengers pushed Tom forward. Go on, you see the captain every day. You go and tell him the food's no good. It's not good enough. You tell him we're not happy. The food's not good enough. Of course, for a 20-year-old to go and confront the captain of the ship was just unheard of. And whether he did confront the captain or not, we'll never know because that page has been torn out. But if you keep reading, Tom does still take the midday sight for the midday reading of what latitude they're on. So he must have been still getting on well with the captain of the ship. So I don't think he confronted him at all, but he didn't want to record that. Or he would have recorded it, but whoever prepared the book for publication ripped that page out because he had kind of agreed that he would do that on behalf of the other passengers.
Yeah.
But I don't think... So that was part of the reason why I wrote the book. The other reason why my book is formatted the way it is with the different fonts is because of that absolutely wonderful book that I love to bits with a wonderful name, the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society.
I've not read the book. I've watched the film. That is I swear, I can't. It came out a few years ago. I'd never heard the story. That is one of my. That was one of my favourite films of that year. I never knew any of that history, and I'm sorry. I as soon as you said that, I knew exactly what. Like I said, I apologise because I haven't read the book. I've only seen the film. It came out a few years ago, and it is one of the most incredible stories I have ever
Yeah.
heard.
Well, wonderful book. The thing that irritated me about that book, well, it didn't irritate me, but I found it laborious, was it's all in the same font and it's all letters written from one person to another. I haven't seen the film, but I love the book bits. But the text is all letters written from one person to another, and you have to struggle to find out who's this letter coming from.
Yeah.
You have to read the last of it first before you understand whose letter you're reading. And I wanted to get over that problem. That's why I used the two different fonts.
I watched the film, and I was fortunate because it become a surprise. So we have this thing. There's a cinema chain in England called the Odeon, and they used to have this thing called, well, they still have it, I just don't use it anymore, but it was called Limitless. So you paid a monthly fee and you could go watch as many films as you want, as often as you wanted, and it was like £20, something like that, it's equivalent to $20, I guess. And because of that, me and my friend, we would literally turn up at the cinema to watch anything, because it's just like, I'm not paying for this.
Money.
Yeah, but it's just like, so, because it's like when you invest in, I mean, the price of the monthly membership was pretty much the price of going to the cinema once, if you include popcorn and drinks. But if you're going 3 or 4 times, sometimes even, if there was lots of things to watch, we'd watch 2 films in the same night. And so you don't bother about drinks and stuff like that. You just turn up with a bottle of water and you take care of yourself. So you just got into this habit of watching films you wouldn't normally go and watch. And that's what that fell into. And the cast was amazing. The story was fantastic. It was a part of World War II history I wasn't aware of.
I'm sure hardly anybody was aware of it.
No, and suddenly you realise, because one of the things that have always fascinated me about, not just war, but actually, like what it would have been like to live in Australia in 1920. For all of the hardship, there were always great examples of humanity. And in the story, when I can't remember if they were in Jersey or Guernsey, but you never consider the fact that that there would have been people falling in love on opposite sides of the war.
Yes.
And from this as a child, and how a group of friends protect this child so that nobody knows where she's from, who she really is, because the parents are one gets killed and one gets pulled away, and it's just both tragic and heartwarming. It's a real sort of roller coaster, menagerie of feelings and emotions, but at the same time, I just never understood or had ever been opened up to that part of history. And you suddenly realise that, even in moments of war, people realise that that person isn't my enemy. Just because they're wearing a different uniform, it doesn't mean we have to be enemies.
Exactly, and it's the intense realism of that book that is so convincing.
Yeah, it is. It's because you can, like I said, I don't want to compare the books. I've never read it, but the film really does highlight the difficulty of that relationship and what the risks they took because they loved each other, and the risks for that child. And it just, like you say, that intensity. And one of the things that astounded me, like I said, because it was new and I'd never seen that or heard of those types of stories before, was the way the friends and family, who would have obviously at the time been outraged, but when it came to regards with the child, they raised the child as their own. And it's just one of those kind of stories that if everybody, if you like reading the book, read the book. If you like films, watch the film. It's an incredible story. It is an incredible story.
Yeah, it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Yes.
Just lastly, I'm just getting conscious of the time, and this is a completely random question that I just like to ask all my guests for no reason whatsoever other than I like the question. So you using your imagination, I want you to imagine it's a completely magical world and you've got a time machine. Okay, so magical world, you've got a time machine. Where would you?
What is a time?
A time machine, so you could go forward in time or backwards in time.
Okay.
Yeah. Where would you go? Why would you go there? What?
Oh, I'd go back to my great-grandmother's era, especially in Tasmania where they lived. I know it wasn't an easy life, but those were the days when a woman's job was to produce at least a dozen children. I loved being pregnant and giving birth and having children and running the household, by which I mean making bread and jam and bottling fruit and pickling things. And it must have been such a rewarding family life in those days. I know that in this country, those people were very advantaged by the value of the wool clip, even in my great-grandmother's day. In my grandmother's day, of course, the wool clip was astonishingly valuable. I don't know if you know, but a pound in weight of greasy fleece paid a white man's wages for a month.
I didn't know that. I did know that once upon a time wool was almost, like up there with gold. It was valuable.
Yes. And so the wealth from the work they put in to tend their flocks, to find natural remedies for the problems in the flocks like fluke and those kind of things. The reward they received was huge. And of course, they didn't squander it. They distributed a lot of it. My own grandfather, for instance, built a school on his sheep station because he recognized that his children were overprivileged having a governess, and that the children of all the people working on the station couldn't read or write, and their parents couldn't read or write. So he built a school and paid a school teacher to teach all the children. And my great-grandfather put a lot of money towards the building of one of those magnificent churches in Oatlands in Tasmania. They're not small sums of money, but no. That was a share of the product or the produce or the rewards, whatever you want to call it, of the work that everybody put in to those sheep stations and so forth. They were whole communities. They weren't just the property of one person or something. The property depended on the whole community working in harmony and so forth. And it must have been a wonderful era. I know that it was very hard. Infant mortality that you mentioned before was extremely high. And I remember asking my mother what happened in your day to children born with recognisable disadvantages like physical handicap and stuff. And she immediately answered without hesitation, they were mercifully carried away by God, dear. And I said, what on earth do you mean by that? And she said, well, when those babies became sick, as they inevitably would, with measles, mumps, chickenpox, whooping cough, scarlet fever, diphtheria, all those things that children are now immunised against, she said that baby would be just put aside and no one would try and nurse it back to health. It would be just mercifully carried away by God. And so, of course, they had big families because they expected to lose some children. But I think it must have been a very rewarding time to be part of. So that would be my time machine thing, go backwards.
And that's perfect.
Go back.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
And there you go. That's Sylvia and Grasp the Nettle. And the history of her family is fascinating and absolutely amazing. And it reminds me of some of the adventures that my grandparents, their brothers and sisters who travelled the world at a time when it did take 6 months to get somewhere, or 6 months for a letter to arrive. So you didn't know if somebody arrived or if somebody died. It's just such a distance from the way we live today. I mean, for example, the fact that I was just on a Zoom call to Sylvia as if we're in the same room talking to each other, when once upon a time, just to send a letter to say, hey, I've got here, I'm alive, would take 6 months for you to find out. That the world has changed. It's just a different place. But I am eternally grateful to be able to have these conversations, as I'm somebody that's passionate about our history, and I believe that history is just our understanding of history and the complexities. It's important. So please do look up Grasp the Nettle by Sylvia Lurch. Buy the book, buy the audio, read it. It's a short read. I have actually ordered mine. It should be here next week. And as always, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for the people that comment, people that share, people that like the podcast. It all helps. And wherever you are from, whatever you believe, please do take care and be blessed. Thank you very much.